can kick things off.
Great. Well, thanks, Nelly. Thanks for the invitation to the American University in Cairo. It's nice to, well, not be there, but to at least be connecting with you. So yeah, I'm a professor of business and society at the University of Bath, and I'm also director here of our Centre on Business Organisations and Society. And I've been doing work over the past, well, 25 years on the kind of corporate responsibility issues and the kind of changing role of business in society, where I've been teaching and researching around these topics for a long time now. And today I'm going to talk about corporate activism, which is the kind of latest project that I've been doing in this space, really looking at kind of how these relationships between business and society are changing, what the expectations are in relation to companies. So I'm planning to talk for about 25 minutes or so. We'll see. Great. I got a bit enthusiastic with my slides, so I might go slightly over, but then I talk very quickly, so I'll try and get through them. So shall I go and share my screen?
Yeah, and yeah, you can. It's up to you what pace you talk at. So it's quite interesting, as I see a few students that I know. So Andrew has more of a southern accent, I have more of a northern accent, so maybe yours will be more understandable than mine. So it's fine to maybe speak quickly. So yeah, so again, thank you, Andrew, the School of Business, the Gerhardt Center, AUC are really, really pleased that you're joining us, and it's a very hot topic as well. And yes, I'll give you the floor, and if anyone has any questions, you can ask through Kerry Mann, you can ask through me, you can, we'll try to maybe wait until Andrew's sort of done his presentation, and then we'll have a little discussion, and then we'll open it up to everyone who has questions or comments or debates or anything like that. So thank you, Andrew, and we look forward to hearing about this.
Great. At the moment, I'm being denied screen sharing. You can just switch it on.
Kerry Mann, can we sort that out and give Andrew the power to share his screen, please? Talking about power as well.
Yeah, let me check with
I think maybe Andrew, maybe while we're just waiting for Kerry Mann to sort of do that, maybe you can just, I don't know if it's being sorted yet or not as we speak. I don't want to pop in a question while you're trying. Don't know if it's.
Idea. Here we
Andrew,
go.
can you give it a try now?
Yes, no, it looks like it's working now.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, great. Perfect. Thank you.
So that should be working, hopefully. So the title of the talk is Corporate Activism, when companies take a public stand on political issues. And so what I'm going to talk about is this particular phenomenon which has arisen in the last, well, that we've really noticed arising in the last few years, which is when companies take this very public stand on political issues. And I'm going to give a little explanation about what this is, corporate activism, perhaps a little bit about why companies do it, give some examples, and really explore also some of the implications of it. So what are the kind of impacts when companies do this, and does it put their stakeholders off? Does it attract them, or under what conditions does it become an attractive thing for companies to do? So the context of this, and certainly the context in terms of my work in this space, is around this kind of changing or the merging, if you like, of business and politics. So the increasing role of business in doing political things, a bit like governments, the role of governments in doing more business-like things, and so this increasing merging of the corporate and the political sphere. And this involves, different aspects, which includes things such as lobbying, where companies very strategically engage in political activity intended to advance their own firm's self-interests. So they engage with governments, they give money to political candidates, they try and influence governments to shape legislation in ways which provide a positive context for firms to operate. So that's one particular type of firms' engagement in politics. And then there's been, interest over the past kind of 2 decades, certainly since I've been doing work in this area, on this kind of changing political role of companies, what I've been calling corporate citizenship, what others might call corporate social responsibility, where firms take on, rather than directly just lobbying governments, where they take on formally government roles, perhaps providing public goods such as water or health or other sorts of public goods, sometimes in public-private partnerships and other things, and also participating in global governance, so setting the rules by which businesses have to play by. So rather than governments alone setting those rules, increasingly firms have been engaged in setting those rules too. So that's the kind of broader context of what we're talking about here. And the received wisdom, though, is that even if firms do politics, do these kind of political things, they shouldn't talk about politics, right? The business and politics don't mix. The firms should be very clear they're doing things for economic interests, that they don't have any political aspirations, they're not involved in politics. And, there's been an assumption that we need to keep those things very separate, and that as soon as firms start wading into the political sphere, there's going to be a problem. But that's changing, right? And that's changing in terms of how firms are starting to talk about this. So a couple of years ago, there was this article in the Harvard Business Review talking about the new CEO activists. So corporate leaders becoming activists, and you can see the megaphone here in the picture, rather than not talking about it very loudly about taking a position on a particular political issue. Here's Fast Company talking about Ben & Jerry's, the American ice cream company, having a corporate activism manager who deals with how they advance their progressive political agenda. Or here from Forbes talking about corporate activism and why these days, if firms stay silent on political issues, that potentially is a bigger risk than actually taking a stand on them. So we've seen quite a big transformation then in this idea that firms shouldn't be talking about politics to one where actually there's an increasing expectation, certainly in the United States and also in other countries, that they really should. So what are we talking about with corporate activism then? So it's different from CSR, it is different from this kind of corporate citizenship type of stuff, it's different from lobbying, it's a particular type of activity. So it's when a company or its CEO, or one of its senior leaders at least, takes a public stand on a social or political issue that's unrelated to the firm's core business in order to contribute to social or political change. So when I say unrelated, basically what we mean here is, so if an oil company takes a stand on climate change, that's directly going to affect its core business. So we wouldn't really regard that as corporate activism. We'd regard that as good old-fashioned lobbying, right? But if an oil company takes a stand on immigration or on race, now these are things which are fairly unrelated to its business. So we'd think about that as more about an activism type of activity. And the idea that it's to contribute to social or political change, now this might be very directly trying to influence governments in terms of legislation, trying to change politicians' minds, or it might be about broader social change, so getting people, changing people's hearts and minds, trying to have an influence on how people think about a particular issue. So whether that is race or immigration or various other things. So here's a couple of examples. And so this has been growing over the last few years, but here's a couple of examples where it really came to light that, particularly in America, that corporate America was taking a political stand on a whole swathe of issues. So on the left here, this is Brian Chesky, the founder of Airbnb. In response to, in 2017, President Trump, when he first came to power, introduced the travel ban preventing people from various Muslim countries from entering into the United States. And so various CEOs of companies at the time took a stand against this and said they didn't agree with this activity of the government. So here's Brian Chesky saying, not allowing countries or refugees into America is not right. We must stand with those who are affected. And then below, he says what Airbnb is doing in relation to this issue. So taking a very strong political stand against current government policy at the time. And then more recently, so various issues have occurred over the last few years, but more recently, in the last year, we've had the big Black Lives Matter protests in the US, and various companies again have taken a strong stand on this issue. And here's Netflix saying, well, to be silent on this issue is to be complicit, Black Lives Matter, and talking about the duty that they have both as an employer, but also as a platform for media to do something about this issue. So these are some of the examples that have started to happen, and it's not just these issues. There's a whole range of social and political issues that have been raised in relation to this, and where companies or their CEOs have taken a stance. And you can see in this graph here how corporate activism has been on the rise over the past decade or so. This is from Max Solomon, this graph, and you can see the gradual rise in total corporate activism events over time. And in the last 2 years, in 2018 and 2019, it's been estimated that more than 1,000 businesses or their chief executive officers have engaged in corporate activism of one sort or another. So it's accelerating. It's getting significantly more likely to occur in the last few years as well. And I'll come back to the conservative and liberal aspects in a moment, but look at that. So these are the positions that companies are taking, and you'll see that certainly in recent years, almost all the positions that companies are taking appear to be liberal positions on an issue, right? So if we take this as a standard political divide between conservative and liberal, companies are taking the liberal position. So corporate activism, though, is divisive, right? If you take a liberal position or if you take a conservative position, you're going to alienate one set of your stakeholders and possibly attract another, right? So it presents potential risks as well as rewards. So let's talk through what these might be, some of these risks and rewards. I'm going to give a couple of examples to explain this. I'm just checking if my video is working here. Make sure that it is, okay. So, a couple of years ago, Nike got involved in corporate activism with this print ad, which is part of a larger TV spot, where they engaged with, this is Colin Kaepernick, a very well-known American footballer who famously in America took the knee in relation, the playing of the national anthem before American football games, as a protest against police brutality, particularly race-based police brutality. And as a result of this, it caused a storm in the United States. But Nike decided to take a side on this and took Kaepernick's side, right? And this was a risky thing to do, and we can see that this created a whole range of different effects when they did this. And you can see, the relation to Kaepernick, the kind of line, he believed in something, even means sacrificing everything. Kaepernick, as a result of this, lost his place in the team, hasn't been able to play in American football since, but refused to change his stance in relation to kneeling during the national anthem. So what happened? Well, on the left here, you can see people took to social media showing that they're burning their Nike shoes. They don't want to have to choose, between their favorite sneakers and their country, and they're going to choose. If they do have to choose, they're going to choose their country, right? And so social media was awash with these sorts of activities of people protesting about this stance that Nike was taking, because it was seen as anti-American in some way. And you can see the graph on the top right here. This is the financial data on Nike, and you can see that the day that the ad was shown, there's a substantial drop of Nike's share price, with the expectation that this was a very risky thing to do. It might affect sales and everything else. But relatively quickly, within the next 3 weeks or so, the share price recovered and in fact got to a record high at the time. And in fact, the kind of data show that Nike in general scored something of a win with this ad, right? That it was a risky thing to engage in, but at the same time, it paid off, so that overall they got more positive coverage than negative coverage, and there was apparently a big boon in sales of Nike shoes at the same time. So here's another one. that happened, again, just a couple of years ago, where Gillette, the razor blade company, released this spot, which fed into the narrative around Me Too and kind of male violence against women. And they took a very strong stand on this issue. And I won't show the film now, but you can find it online on YouTube and elsewhere. And the film is saying that there's a problem with what they call toxic masculinity, and that men have to change the way that they behave towards women and towards each other. And this, again, caused an enormous controversy when it came out, because here was Gillette taking a stance on a particular issue, which many people thought they shouldn't be wading into. What does this have to do with selling razor blades? So they faced a backlash. People proposing a boycott of Gillette products. If you go onto YouTube, you can see all the negative comments that it received. And in fact, on YouTube, there are many more negative comments than positive ones, many more dislikes than likes. Similarly, Marketing Week here, that the brand took a hit as the ad backfires. But there were also lots of positive coverage of the story too, and a study of the top 100, so the most read web articles about the ad, and you can see the distribution here, that 37% were positive, 22% were negative, and 41% were neutral. And in fact, this plays out also over social media in general. If you look at the data on Facebook and on Twitter, the overall sentiment is more positive than negative for Gillette, even though on YouTube, the overall sentiment is negative. So it creates this, it's a divisive issue, it's a divisive way of presenting it, and it creates this kind of challenge for a brand when they start wading into this area. So those are a couple of examples, and what I want to just talk over the next couple of minutes is just what some of the research has now shown. So over the past kind of 2 or 3 years, really, that's all, there's been an increasing engagement of academic research in this field, which I've been participating in as well. I just want to give you a little flavour of some of the things that we've found in relation to how stakeholders respond to corporate activism. So trying to look at under what conditions is this going to work, and under what conditions is it not going to work. So let's look at consumers. So a couple of studies here. One shows that CEO activism will significantly increase a consumer's propensity or likelihood to buy a company's products when they agree with the stance that the company is taking in relation to the activism. But there's no effect if they disagree with the stance. All right, so there's only this kind of positive motivation to buy. That's from Chatterjee and Toffel. Then another study tried to get kind of a little bit deeper into this question and looked at, well, what does it depend on the company as well? And what Kosh and et al. Found was that companies perceived to be values-led companies, so companies which are already seen as being, having strong values of social responsibility, when those companies engage in corporate activism, consumers respond positively and are more likely to buy their products. But if companies are perceived to be more performance-oriented, right, so not values-led necessarily, but really focused on just having effective, good products, then consumers might more likely to react negatively to the activism. So there's a big difference, okay, in terms of the type of company you are and then the type of stand that you might make. So that's consumers, or at least some of the emerging research that's around consumers. I mean, some of this work isn't even published yet. It's just to give a sense of the sort of work that's coming out. Employee response. So how do employees respond when companies or their CEO take a stand on a political issue? So Vanessa Barbano, what she found using kind of online platforms to see when people who engaged in working on online platforms, whether there was a motivating effect or not of working for a company that was engaged in corporate activism. What she found was that there was, in different finding to the consumer one, so that if employees disagree with the stance, then there's a demotivating effect. But if they agree with the stance, there's not actually a significant motivating effect. So it'll stop them working harder if they really don't like the stance that the company has taken. So they don't agree. If a company's taken a stance on gun control, either for or against, if the employee doesn't agree, they're less likely to work hard for that company. And then the second and third points here is from a study that I've been involved in with my colleagues, the Berglin et al. Paper. And we looked at job seekers. So looking at whether this type of activism, so we were looking in particular at CEO activism, so when corporate leaders take a position, and whether this had an effect on whether people want to go and work for a company. And what we found was that job seekers were significantly more attracted to companies with CEOs who took a liberal position compared to CEOs who took a conservative position or no position on an issue. And our explanation for this is that this is because when CEOs take a liberal stance, this is increasingly seen as the appropriate CEO role-related behaviour. Like, we expect CEOs to take a liberal stance. So let me explain this a little bit and show you the data. So this is just from our basic study, right? But before we looked into all the kind of moderating and mediating effects. And we did a whole series of studies, but this was the first one. This was kind of using kind of real choices of job seekers on a platform. And we can see here that if a CEO takes a liberal position, you can see the difference compared to if the CEO takes a conservative position or a non-activist position is tremendous, right? That people are much, much more likely to want to work for a company that takes a liberal position on a political issue. Now, you're probably thinking, well, that's going to depend on the type of people that you ask, right? But the scale of this is very significant, right? And it does depend, though, as well. And so that's what we looked at next. And you'll see here. So here the issue was, as you'll see along the bottom, was around same-sex marriage. Again, in the US, this was using US consumers, US job seekers. And what you can see here is that in the blue is where the CEO is taking a conservative position, the red is non-activism, and the green is liberal activism. And so you can see the job pursuit intentions. So even when, well, let's talk about the one on the left first. So we've got a very big difference between liberal, so when the CEO takes the liberal activism compared to if they take conservative activism. And that's because the position of the job seeker is aligned also with the position that the company is taking, right? That here the CEO is expressing a strong attitude in favour of same-sex marriage, as is the job seeker. But even where we get job seekers who have a more moderate attitude towards same-sex marriage in the middle here, or where they have a strong attitude against same-sex marriage, right, which would be the more conservative position, even there we can see that liberal activism is preferred to the conservative activism. Right? So even when people disagree with the stance overall, they still would prefer CEOs to take a liberal position. This is to some extent counterintuitive, right? That we think it's only about that we would only support a position if we agree with it. But it's not just about that. Our argument is that what's happening here is that people are agreeing with liberal activism because liberal activism is what they expect of CEOs. This is the norm. And here are the data, again, from Max Solomon, in terms of how many companies have engaged in liberal activism versus conservative activism over the past decade. And 44% of companies in the Standard & Poor's 500 in the US engage in liberal activism, but only 5% in conservative activism. So people expect now that liberal activism is what companies will engage in. And so this is the norm. And so we'll expect it and we'll support it and regard it as an appropriate behavior of CEOs. Whereas conservative activism is much more risky, we might not regard it as appropriate behavior. And there's one final stakeholder we might be interested in is how governments might respond to this, right? If you take a position against or for what the government is saying, how are they going to respond? And unfortunately, there's no academic research on this as yet, but I think there's some starting to be developed and coming out. But just to give you another couple of stories around this. So again, in the US, there's been a lot of CEO activism or corporate activism in relation to positions held by President Trump. We talked about the travel ban earlier. Other CEOs have come out and taken a stand against issues around race and climate change and other sorts of things. But not all of them. And so the question is, so, you know, under what conditions would a CEO stand up to the government? And what are the risks of doing so, right? If you stand up to a president like President Trump, is there going to be a negative effect for your company then in terms of how then the government is going to treat it? So it can be very risky. Another example, as we've seen recently in Hong Kong and China introducing a new security law, which has led to all these protests in Hong Kong. The two kind of international banks, HSBC and Standard Chartered, took a position on this and took a position supporting China's introduction of the security laws. That led to, you know, a negative reaction amongst many people in Hong Kong, a negative reaction in America, where the Secretary of State in the US criticized HSBC, for example, but obviously a very positive response in China. And so here we have, you know, companies trying to position themselves in relation to different governments and where they stand on some of these political actions. So then just the last thing I wanted to say around this is, okay, when we start thinking about this in relation to governments and firms, you know, what does this all mean for our democracy? And so is this kind of corporate activism, is it good for our democracy or is it bad for democracy? So on the one side, you know, corporate activism can provide what we might call a countervailing power in political systems. If we've got very powerful governments, if companies or CEOs stand up to them, then we've got some kind of balance perhaps happening, right? That's one way of thinking about it. But on the other side, we've got very reasonable concerns that, you know, these are very powerful companies already. These are very rich CEOs. So when they start engaging in politics, that can really subvert our democracy because they already are very powerful, and this will just reinforce their powerful positions. So what I want to say about this really is that I don't think we should a priori, so we shouldn't, like, on the face of it, just exclude particular actors from some kind of involvement in the democratic process, in this kind of deliberation in any way. It really depends how they're going to participate, right? There's nothing wrong with CEOs publicly stating their position on an issue. It then becomes, well, then what do they do about it? How exactly do they communicate that? And so the importance then is, okay, do they help to enable debate of others, right? Do they then encourage other voices to join in? And we've seen with many of these examples that they do create enormous great debate on social media and other places about these issues and really engage people in politics. They have to avoid kind of dominating the conversation, so excluding negative comments against them and those sorts of things. And they need to be transparent, both about the position they take, their position in other respects. So if a company is, for example, taking a position on racial equality, what are they doing inside their company? Are they still kind of living up to the position that they're taking? So they need to be very transparent about their position, why they're doing this, and how it plays out in terms of what they're doing. So just to wrap up then, and I think we can then move into a kind of discussion around this, because, you know, I don't have all the answers to this in any way, and this is kind of a new area of research. I think it's a fascinating one. There's lots of questions that it raises, I think. So corporate activism is escalating in many countries. I mean, lots of these examples have been from the US, but there's many examples across Europe, We have examples in Asia as well, but not in all countries. It's not happening everywhere. Perhaps in the Q&A, we can perhaps talk about what's likely to happen where you are, particularly in Egypt, but other countries in the region and across the world. And so far, it appears to be broadly welcomed, right? That people are not kind of criticising this too much so far. Secondly, the liberal position, at least in the US, is normal and expected by stakeholders. And so if a company or a CEO adopts a progressive stance on political issues, right, this liberal position, in the US at least, that's relatively low risk, right? There is dangers in getting engaged in politics, but that's actually lower risk than engaging in a conservative position. But these kind of positive or negative reactions will also depend on a variety of things. The company's identity, whether it's perceived as values-led or performance-led, the values of its stakeholders, do they agree with the position? And of course, the execution, right? How do firms exactly articulate this position? How well is it articulated? And how do they play out after that? And best practice in this area, as far as we understand it so far, requires firms to understand their stakeholders, right? They need to know what their stakeholders think or they should do before they start wading into these sorts of issues, because they need to know, have an understanding of their stakeholders to know how they're likely to respond. Then they also have to ensure transparency. They have to be consistent, right? Not say one thing somewhere and then do something somewhere else. And then follow through, or what Vredenberg et al. Recently called engaging what might be deemed kind of authentic activism, right? It can't just be a statement and then that's it, right? It has to be backed up by something. It needs real activity to make it real. So thank you for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but those are, if anyone wants to continue the conversation after the talk today, those are my coordinates on email, Twitter, LinkedIn, or my website. Please feel free to contact me at any time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. We've already had quite a few questions, and I'm going to come to them in about a few minutes. I just want to ask you, is corporate activism particularly new? Did we see it 100 years ago even, around perhaps the war, the Industrial Revolution? Sort of beyond the term corporate activism, and I know some people have been thinking about, so what's the difference between maybe CSR? So I don't know if you could tell us, is this something new? Is it because everything that's happening around the world, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, social movements, the Arab Spring, etc., or is it something that we've seen many years ago in some sort of different form?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I would say that we have seen it before, absolutely, and I think there was it was much more normal for companies to be engaged in these things, and perhaps not many companies, but large companies would perhaps take a political stance. But this increasingly became unfashionable and regarded as inappropriate, right? Particularly with the rise of kind of shareholder value maximization, the obsessive focus of firms on financial performance and on their economic role, and this whole idea of Milton Friedman that the role of firms is business, it's not politics, and they should keep out, and that's been very influential. And I'd say in the past 30, 40 years, firms have been very reluctant to engage in politics, and so it's a resurfacing to something, or a resurgence of some of these things. But again, that will vary by countries as well, and political systems. And certainly in some systems, it's not even allowed for firms to do this, or it's much more risky for them to do so. So it depends a lot. But talking about the kind of Anglo-American world, at least, it's something that was there to some extent, disappeared, and is making a particular type of resurgence. The sort of social movements that you were talking about, the sort of issues that you're talking about, are of a particular kind that I think have raised this kind of need for companies to take a very strong stance on some of these issues. You're muted. No, still can't hear you.
Sorry, please stop muting. I keep being muted. So just another question, and I know we're sort of all sick of talking about the pandemic. Is there a role that the pandemic has played in terms of activism as well? For example, in the UK with the furloughing, and a lot of sort of companies talking about that, about creating inequality, about social justice, even around the world. Has the pandemic brought about any changes, shifts, nuances in sort of corporate activism, or any sort of variation of that?
Yeah, it's difficult to know. I would say that there's certainly been, CEOs and companies have engaged to some extent in activism during this, but probably less than we might have anticipated in many ways. There's been more of a kind of general expectation that they're going to support government policy in general. There's certainly been some companies that have been resistant to what governments have been doing and been taking a very strong political stand against it, often for very self-interested reasons, but also sometimes just as there's a disagreement on policy, and so taking a different stand on what's the right way to go on some of these things. So I think that, yes, whether it's, I'm not sure it's changed the nature of corporate activism, but I think that it's certainly been another arena where there's been the potential for companies and their CEOs to kind of make a stand on a big issue at a time.
I mean, I suppose I'll be a cynic, and perhaps all of us and a few people have noted in the messages as well, is why? Is it a case of, and I know you talk about sort of the moral stance, and you talk a lot about as well ideas of freedom, and is this political activism? Is it really political activism, or is it something for the organization, for the corporate, ultimately even for the shareholders? I mean, we see with Nike and other brands, even if you look at aspects of CSR as well, we know that it can have, and like your presentation said, increased shareholder return for shareholders. So is it really political activism? Do CEOs really care, or is it in the best interest of the organization? And relatedly as well, is the CEO's position strong enough if they take a stance on whether it's, gender issues, politics, LGBT, is it strong enough to steer the organization into a different arena, whether it's in terms of, if we talk about strategy, in terms of their market position, in terms of what kind of customer they have, is it strong enough?
Yeah. The issue about whether it's genuine, if you like, activism, you can never tell for sure. Of course, you can never know what the motivations are. But I think there's a whole bunch of things that are happening here which strike many people as you wouldn't do that if you were only focused on the bottom line, right? There is a risk attached to it, for sure, right? You're going to alienate some part of your customer and employee base, for sure, right? If you take a stand on an issue, right? Most firms will take a liberal stand. That's still going to alienate, to some extent, your conservative stakeholders, of which there are many. It is going to alienate you to some extent from the US government, right? If you're going to come out against President Trump, as a number of companies have. There are risks attached to this, which are non-negligible, which are the kind of things that shareholders would go, just don't do it. I mean, you don't need to create a risk, right? They just get on with making money and selling products. You don't need to do this stuff. It's too risky. Now, for a company like Nike, it's perhaps a little bit different because this fits in very much with the brand identity of the firm. Right, and to some extent the target market, right? They're quite heavily oriented towards customers of different ethnicities and what have you. They have a very large kind of black market in the US in particular, but also in many other countries. So, and also this kind of idea of being different and standing out and being exceptional are all very integral parts of the brand identity. So in their case, I think it was a very calculated risk, very much. For someone like Gillette, I would say that it was a much more risky thing for them to do because it really wasn't part of their brand identity at all, right? The brand is decent razor blades, not the brand for being against toxic masculinity, right? That's not a part of their brand identity at all. And so that's a much more risky engagement. And many of these other ones that we see, firms start taking a position on the kind of fairly sensitive political issues, there's going to be some fallout. And even though what we show with the research is that on average there's a positive effect, that means you're going to lose, though, some of your customers, some of your employees. And so then the question does come to, okay, so how does that then transform the company in some ways? And that's difficult to say. So, some research is starting to look at now. So if this attracts job seekers with a particular political orientation, right, are you going to become a more liberal company because you're attracting more liberal job seekers, for example? When the founder of Starbucks came out in relation to a whole swathe of issues, but around race and other things, and he said, look, if our shareholders don't agree with this, then they shouldn't hold shares in our company, right? And so you argue it is going to change the complexion of your company because those shareholders then will exit, but others may enter, and so you may change the nature of shareholding, of the shareholder community. You may change the nature of your customers, you may change the nature of your employees. So yeah, it can be transformational to companies as well. I think over time, there's likely to be that effect.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to just come to a few questions, and I'm going to ask people to ask the questions themselves, if that's possible. So in the context, obviously, the American University in Cairo, in Egypt, this is something that we'd maybe like to talk about in the context of Egypt and the MENA region. So I'm going to come to Hassan El-Maliki. Hassan, if you could ask the question yourself and discuss it with Andrew. So you should be unmuted and go ahead, Hassan. If he's still there. There we go. Okay, Hassan, feel free. If you unmute yourself.
Yeah, it's okay now.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, the question is very simple as I wrote it exactly, because activism is usually tends to be a little bit hard. I mean, people against activism. Some people are against, especially in corporate and at work. So there must be a kind of, I wrote it this way, soft tools or a simple way not to be a very aggressive activist, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Especially in some countries. So I still want to be activist, but I don't want to show that I'm very aggressive, if you know what I mean. Because generally activism is, the result of activism in the end is a little bit aggressive, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think just as an add-on to that, Andrew, just to put in sort of the context of culture, there is perhaps the view, the assumption of the word activism itself, in particular political activism, that you kind of just have red lights of, I'm going to get in trouble. So I think, what Hassan says, and of course, many countries around the world, not just in the region, we're bound by socio-cultural, gender, issues as well. So I think Hassan's question is really useful for us all to understand that, being politically active and having a voice is not only very vogue now, but I think especially the younger generation see a benefit in it. And in what ways can people engage in a soft, maybe a small p political activism?
Yeah, there's a nice paper actually by Craig Smith and Daniel Caution in the Sloan Management Review, I think it is, which talks about some of the different approaches which firms might take from kind of hard activism to soft activism. And for them, it depends on kind of how material the issue is for the company. So if it's not really kind of a really strong issue for you as a company in terms of how you're seeing your identity and those sorts of things, then you might not get so, kind of active in your activism, so strong in your activism, for example. And so, there are definitely softer tools, Hassan, to come to your question, such as letter writing, right? So when CEOs write a letter, submit the letter. It may be more or less public. It will be public, but it depends how much it's promoted and out there. That's a much lesser stand than creating a very sophisticated 2-minute ad that you're going to put on movie screens and TV screens and get everyone to watch it and create a conversation. Right. So for it to be activism, it has to be about some degree of a public statement and some degree of trying to create some change. But there are definitely softer ways of doing that. And some of the other softer ways are when firms join with other firms. And so in the past, much activism was happening with coalitions, right, through business associations, rather than through individual companies or individual CEOs standing up and saying, I believe in this. It was much more of a, we believe that this is the right position to take on this issue and that perhaps, this needs reconsidering, this kind of thing, right? So there are definitely soft tools that are out there.
And presumably when corporations come together to lobby or to be activists on a certain situation, then surely that will change their market position as well and their competitiveness towards each other, against each other. I mean, have we seen any examples of where companies come together and that, if we come from even a strategy perspective, market perspective, does that change how they react and interact with each other as well?
Yeah, I think it's possible. We've seen in the US, for example, where on Trump's has a I forget what he calls it, a kind of business council, CEO council advisors. And so when he pulled out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, several of those advisors publicly retreated and resigned from that. And then others resigned later when he failed to denounce white supremacists in the US. And so then another 2 retracted. And you can see then, these kind of, often those, the ones that stayed and the ones that left would sometimes be in the same industry. And so you can see this kind of divergence of the industry on this issue. One company taking a stand, the other one either being perceived as not taking a stand or taking a stand in the opposite direction. And so that then can play out in terms of how they're regarded by consumers or employees or others in terms of their positioning in the market space. Absolutely. And there's only so many positions you can take, though, on an issue, right? It tends to be, these are polarizing issues, typically. So it's either you're on this side or that side. It doesn't leave much space for positioning. You're either right or left, typically. And so it's quite hard to differentiate yourself as a firm in that sense, right? Because there's not much variation that can happen.
So I just have a question from the Netherlands. FG, do you want to talk to us? Maybe, yeah. Okay. So I don't know where he is. FG, do you want to say your question? There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. So from the Netherlands, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm indeed from the Netherlands. My name is Evie Gelder. And I have actually 2 questions regarding the research on context. So, for example, in the Netherlands, there is a company, they are quite considered left. They sell fair trade chocolate. And they took a stance in the Black Lives Matter discussion. Well, that raised a lot of discussions in the Netherlands. People were quite against it. And then my second question regards to, do people subsequently walk their talk? So still the company's sales are ongoing. So that are 2 questions regarding if there's research on these matters. And if so, cultural context, and do people walk their talk?
Okay, thank you. Did you get that, Andrew?
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, the cultural context. Most of the research, the academic research so far, has been on the US. I think because so much of these kind of examples and things have been happening in the US. But it's going to be fascinating, I think, as we explore it into other countries and contexts. in terms of how people perceive both the acceptability of companies wading in on these issues and the kind of appropriateness of firms taking liberal versus conservative positions and how that plays out in kind of norms in the country. So if our research is right that the liberal position is the norm now, and that's, we would regard that as an appropriate role for a CEO to take a liberal position. That's why you might get a similar, we may see a similar response in other countries which have broadly similar economic and political systems. And the Netherlands, there's obviously big differences with the US, but in some broad terms, there may be some similarity in those things. So I think we need to find out, would be the question. What's interesting about that, though, I think, is that the US is probably one of the most polarized countries going, right? It's so divided between right and left. And the Netherlands is a much more moderate country by comparison. And so if we see that even in a very polarized country like the US, there's such a strong expectation that firms will take a liberal position, we might expect that to be, even more so the case in more moderate countries which don't have these big divides. But we need to find out. And then the second question, what was it again? I should have written it down.
So she was just asking if people do really walk their talk. I think we sort of, we talked about that. I mean, we never really particularly know what's genuine. It's, I suppose there's all sorts of external factors, etc., that can affect that. I mean, we don't really know if political leaders are genuine or not.
Yeah, so I mean, the Gillette example, for example, is a good one in that there was this ad, got a lot of publicity, but also they engaged a lot. I mean, they made donations to women's charities. They built platforms for engagement on this issue. They did engage in a broader, they've set out a kind of 2-year strategy for engaging in this issue rather than here's our ad and now we're done kind of thing. With the Black Lives Matter issue, I think that's been what a lot of the criticism has been, is that companies are very happy to say, yeah, we believe in Black Lives Matter. And then their HR policies would tell a different story when we look at what's going on under the bonnet. So it's crucial, right, that when you take these stands, that if it's going to be believable or authentic, then there has to be real action behind it.
Yeah, I think it's one of those questions, how do you ever know, really? So I just want to go to Ahmed Shaheen, please. So if you could introduce yourself and ask your question, and then we'll perhaps have one more and then we'll wrap up. So if anyone has any burning questions, please send them across. Ahmed?
Yes, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Andrew, for this talk. I'm Ahmed Shaheen. I'm a graduate student at AUC. I have one question regarding the research that states that people or consumers usually positively perceive companies or CEOs that are liberally active rather than conservatively active. So the question is, was the initial bias of the study sample taken into consideration in this research? I have just one more example. The other day I attended another session regarding women empowerment, and they in their talk they talked about researches that confirms that having women on board will improve the company's financial performance. I am with women, right, to be empowered. However, was it actually true that women actually add value to the board? Regardless of this question, my main question is about, do people actually perceive liberal companies more better, or is it just biased? We just need to make sure that this is true. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, it's an important point. So when I showed you two graphs, two charts, and so the first one was not taken into account the bias, right? It was just the raw findings. That was across everybody, but you saw the big difference between 57 versus 4, whatever it was, the huge difference between perceiving a kind of liberally active company as beneficial compared to a conservative one. But then when we did take into account the position that the individuals held on the issue themselves, then we still found, much to our surprise, that a liberal position was preferred to a conservative one, even amongst people that held the conservative position on the issue. That was surprising, right? We didn't expect. We thought, all the research so far has all talked about alignment, right? That's what explains what's going on. Alignment matters. It certainly makes this much stronger, but the liberal position appears to be the one that is, in general, preferred. Whether you're, particularly if you take a liberal position yourself, even if you're fairly moderate on the issue, you don't mind either way. And even just about if you take a conservative position.
Yeah, really interesting, Andrew. And I think it's also, I'm thinking about it myself because my mum is English, my dad is Egyptian. I grew up in Saudi Arabia in the 90s in Riyadh. I've lived in Egypt for 5 years. And I was just thinking, as you were using the word liberal, it's also what we all view as liberal, not only in terms of our, maybe morals. I use the word loosely, also how we dress, how we speak, what we believe is right and wrong. And of course, in societies that are religious as well, that will be informed and shaped by, religion, society, all sorts of complexities. And I think this idea of liberal has changed over the years so much, with women's roles, with, sexuality, with activism, with all these sorts of things. And, we've even seen a lot in the Arab Spring with the uprisings, disillusionment in, government, various aspects, but sort of in some ways informed and underpinned by social and, personal issues of morality and values. So I think, I don't know what's going to happen in this region. Maybe we can ask you and maybe draw on Raymond from Nigeria. He's also asked, the question or the comment, and perhaps you can reflect upon this. So he said, multinational corporations operating in most African countries are banned by the laws of these countries from engaging in political social activism. So Africa and also the MENA region. At what stage of social or political unrest can we say such corporations have a moral obligation or responsibility to speak out and take a stand? Feel like you have a moral obligation, and what do we mean by moral and what do we mean by obligation? So I think that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, we actually, as we've discussed several times, we obviously have to take into account context, cultural context, and the kind of liberal versus conservative position is one that is reasonably well understood, but it's going to be differently realised in different contexts, absolutely, and what the kind of topics will be that are included within that. And it changes over time as well, right? There's what was once regarded as liberal might not be regarded as liberal anymore, and these kind of things. So that all has to be part of it. So that's why so much of this research has taken place just in one context so far, because that's the one we kind of broadly understand. We can we can use the platform of previous research to go forward in other studies. Going internationally is going to be fascinating and important. It does take you in a new direction. And just on that last point, which I think is a really great one, is whether companies have a moral obligation to engage in this. And I saw there's a couple of people ask similar kind of questions.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm going to say Farida's in my class, so just to boast that I have these bright students. So yeah, I mean, do they have a moral responsibility? And I think also, just as maybe a point to what you're saying, is that in Egypt we do see aspects like, for example, we see businessmen, we see small businesses side with political parties, and yes, that's not corporate activism, if you like, but it is taking a political stance, a political support. So we do see, some, aspects here. We see also a lot of MNCs take a big stance of employing a certain quote women. A lot around in Egypt happening around gender. We see paternity pay becoming in corporations as well. So it's not sort of corporate activism as such, but it's maybe the soft P, if you like, leading the way with certain practices, like how you said, well, HR would say, well, this isn't happening. And here, I think a lot of, specifically MNCs, are leading the way with a lot of best practices that maybe we see in the West as well. So maybe this sort of smaller P as well. Andrew, I think we could all stay all night. There's been lots of private questions and comments, and I would encourage everyone to message Andrew, to email him, to tweet. I think it's been a really interesting, really interesting session, and I'm really excited to see what's going to happen in the future as well around corporate activism and around sort of issues of morality as well. I think these are big hot topics, and we hopefully will welcome you back in the future to maybe talk to us about your updated research or new research as well. So thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you on behalf of the Gerhardt Center, the School of Business, the American University in Cairo, and definitely everyone here. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.